For this week in China and the world, we will be looking at Uyghur history, contextualizing Xinjiang. There are a number of historical periods in the history of Xinjiang that are important to keep in mind, including a mythical and contested past long before the Common Era begins. However, the first distinct historical period that we should look at is the period of the Uyghur Khaganate from 744 to 840 CE. Then you have a period of independent Uyghur kingdoms, and then the Mongol period during the rise of the Mongol Empire, basically from the 13th through the 18th century. This is followed by the Qing dynasty period and the Republican era and the PRC era that you know so well by this point in the course. Now, contextually, it's important for us to recognize that the Uyghur are part of this larger family of Altaic peoples that inhabits a massive section of the Asian continent, includes a massive number of languages, pictured here on the right-hand side of the slide. But then, these Altaic languages are broken up into a number of groups, which include Korean and also Japanese, for example. Within that, you have a family of Turkic languages. So, within the Turkic group, you have such languages as Turkish, but then you also have languages like Uyghur, which are related. The Turkic specific subgroup related closely to Turkish is pictured in red here, but those languages related most closely to Uyghur and the Uyghur branch are pictured in green. To understand later developments in Xinjiang, you have to understand Jungaria. The Qing dynasty conquered Mogulistan of the Mogul people in the 18th century. The Mogul people being a Turkic group related to the Mughal dynasty in India. After this 18th century conquest, the area was invaded, and the Qing dynasty also invaded Jungaria in 1759, and it dominated Jungaria until 1864. The territory was renamed Xinjiang soon after the Qing invasion of the Junga. Historians estimate that 1 million people were slaughtered during the course of this invasion, and the Qing dynasty conquest would be considered genocidal in contemporary terms. The land was so devastated from the conflict that the natural environment took more than a generation to recover. There was also a widespread trade of enslaved people in Xinjiang that took place in the 19th century. The Uyghur were administered by a system of what are called Bei, spelled B-E-G-S, but Bei, under the control of the Manchu military officials. They in fact participated in the slaughter of the Jungar. The Han Hui, currently known as the Hui Chinese, another Muslim group, and the Han Chinese had to wear what are called Q during this period of time, a particular hairstyle that was famous. It's spelled Q-U-E-U-E. But it was a marker of the Qing dynasty. But it was generally understood that local Turkic groups and Turkic Muslims, like the Chanto Hui, also known as the Uyghur, and the Salah Hui, also known as the Salars, did not have to wear this Q hairstyle. The Q is a hairstyle worn by both Altaic Jurchen and also Manchu people of Manchuria, so other Altaic groups. It was later required to be worn by male subjects under the Qing dynasty in China as a sign of assimilation into Qing dynasty culture. After the invasion of Kashgar by Jahangir Khoja, a Turkestani Muslim Bey system grew in the region, and officials in Xinjiang eagerly fought for the privilege, perhaps ironically, of wearing this Q to show their steadfast loyalty to the Qing Empire. High-ranking Bey were granted this right, so it was not seen as a sign of assimilation in that sense by the general population, but something that was actually desirable. The eagerness of Turkai and Uyghur Bey to voluntarily wear the queue was contrasted with the Han and the Hui, who were forced to wear it. This is perhaps ironic. The map that you see here on the left-hand side of the slide is a map of the Dzungar Khanate by a Swedish officer in captivity there from the 18th century, from 1716 to 1733, which included the region that we know today as Jiangsu. The photo on the lower right-hand side of the slide is actually individuals from Indochina, which is now Vietnam, who were wearing the queue as a sign of assimilation into Qing dynasty culture, even outside of the Qing dynasty borders. In the 19th century in Xinjiang, there was an infamous revolt of 1864. After this revolt of 1864, the Uyghurs were successful in expelling the Qing dynasty officials from East Turkestan and founded an independent Kashgaria kingdom called Yetishar, the country of the seven cities. Under the leadership of Yaqub Bey, who's pictured here on the left in a depiction from the era, this region included Kashgar, Yarkand, Hotan, Aksu, Kucha, Korla, and Turpan. The kingdom was recognized by the Ottoman Empire in 1873, by Tsarist Russia in 1872, and by Great Britain in 1874, which established a mission in the capital of Kashgar. Uyghur Muslim forces under Yaqub Bey declared a religiously inspired revolt against Chinese Muslims under Tu Ming or To Ming during the Dungan Revolt during this brief period in the 19th century. They even used the term jihad to explain the type of revolt or the type of military movement. This was actually part of a construction, jihad fi sabilillah, which could be any form of external struggle. It doesn't necessarily have to be military, but nonetheless, this was used. This is during a period when the term jihad fi sabilillah is actually becoming more popular in anti-colonial contexts. So it speaks to this notion that this revolt is an anti-colonial revolt, but an anti-colonial revolt perhaps against Chinese forces and Chinese Muslims, right? So two different Muslim groups in this region. The Uyghurs thought that the Chinese Muslims were also Shafi'i predominantly, and since the Uyghurs were predominantly Hanafi, this speaks to some inter-Sunni contestations with regard to their interpretations of fiqh or jurisprudence. And this was also used in the period as a justification for the violent conflict between the two groups. Yaqub Bey enlisted non-Muslim Han Chinese militia under Xu Shuihong in order to fight against the Chinese Hui Muslims as well. Dou Ming's forces were defeated by Yaqub Bey in the Battle of Urumqi in 1870, and Yaqub Bey planned to conquer the rest of Kashgaria and succeeded through 1873. Yaqub intended to seize all of Dungan territory eventually and create this sort of Central Asian Turkic Muslim kingdom or Turkic Muslim states that would force Chinese Muslims to flee from the region and also force other Chinese eventually to leave the region. However, large Qing Manchu dynasty forces under General Zhu Zhontang attacked Kashgaria in 1876. Fearing Tsarist expansion into eastern Turkestan, Great Britain also supported the Qing invasion forces through loans by British banks, mostly through Boston Bank, located in the British colony of Hong Kong. So British finances supported this repression of Central Asian Turkic Muslims. In the 1870s, large Qing Manchu dynasty forces united under General Zhu Zhontang and, as I previously mentioned, attacked Kashgaria in 1876. This movement, this trajectory, was part of establishing a new trajectory of the history of the region. It was after this initial invasion that East Turkestan was renamed Xinjiang, which itself means new dominion or new territory. But it's really part of a construction in classical Chinese that refers to old territory newly returned. And that construction is shortened to Xinjiang in Chinese by the Qing Empire on November 18th of 1884. It's essentially the creation of a new province. The Uyghur in the region identified themselves to each other by their oasis as either Karayanese, Khotanese, or Kashgari. They didn't have this sort of unified Uyghur identity except to external forces. Eventually, in the 20th century, the Soviets in this early Soviet movement, especially in the early 20th century, met with the Uyghur in 1921 during a meeting of Turkic leaders in Tashkent. This meeting established the Revolutionary Uyghur Union, which was a communist nationalist organization that opened underground sections in principal cities of Kashgaria and was active for the next 5 years before it was shut down in 1926 when the Soviets recognized the post-Qing Xinjiang government and concluded trade agreements with it. By 1920, Uyghur nationalism had become a challenge to central Chinese governments, the Republic of China government, but also to warlords in the Western Republic of China, especially to the warlord Yang Zhengxin, who controlled a central part of Xinjiang. The Turpan-based poet Abdul Halik, having spent his early years in Semipalatinsk, modern-day Semey, and the Jadid intellectual centers in Uzbekistan, returned to Xinjiang with a pen name during this period, a name that he later styled as a surname. This name was Uyghur. He wrote the famous nationalist poems during this period, which opened up with the line, I Peker Uyghur Ohian. Please excuse my pronunciation if I'm a little bit off. Hey, poor Uyghur, wake up. He was later martyred by the Chinese warlord Shang Shikai in Turpan in March of 1933 for inciting Uyghur nationalist sentiments through his poetic works. Uyghur independence activists staged several uprisings against the post-Qing and Shang Kuomintang rule. Twice in 1933 and 1944, the Uyghurs successfully regained their independence, in part backed by the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The first East Turkestan Republic was a short-lived republic, however, but it was centered around Kashgar. It was, unfortunately for the Uyghur, destroyed by Chinese Muslim armies under General Ma Zhencheng and Ma Puyuan in the Battle of Kashgar in 1934. The Second East Turkestan Republic only lasted for 5 years from 1944 to 1949. The Second East Turkestan Republic was predominantly located in what is now Ili Kazakh Autonomous Prefecture. The Ili Rebellion was fought by the Kuomintang against the Second East Turkestan Republic, the Soviet Union, and the Mongolian People's Republic during the period of the 1940s. The pro-independence Uyghur were divided between pro-Turkey and pro-Soviet factions during the Civil War, and they confronted one another very violently. From the days of the Second East Turkestan Republic, you see Ahmedjan Qasimi and Abdul Karim Abbas with Sun Fo, the son of Sun Yat-sen in Nanjing, pictured here on the left-hand side of the slide from November 24th of 1946. Ahmedjan Qasim, the chairman of the Xinjiang Democratic League of Peace, is also pictured here in 1948. In 1949, after the Chinese nationalists, known as the Kuomintang, lost the civil war in the People's Republic of China and led to the proclamation of the People's Republic of China as it is today, the Second East Turkestan Republic's leaders refused to form a confederate relation with Mao Zedong's PRC. However, a plane crash tragically killed many of the East Turkestan Republic's leaders and much of their international delegation. The surviving leader, pictured here on the right-hand side of the slide, Saifuddin Azizi, joined the PRC's Communist Party and professed loyalty to the PRC after the plane crash. Soon afterward, General Wang Chun marched on East Turkestan through the deserts, suppressing anti-invasion uprisings, and Mao turned the Second East Turkestan Republic into the Ili Kazakh Autonomous Prefecture, and appointed Azizi as the region's first Communist Party governor. Many Republican loyalists fled into exile in Turkey and European countries during this period. As part of Mao Zedong's larger project of reform and consolidation, the name Xinjiang was changed to Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in 1955, where the Uyghur became the largest ethnic group. The Uyghurs are also mostly concentrated in southwestern Xinjiang today. A committee of independent experts with ties to the United Nations had one of its U.S. members claim from credible reports recently that the PRC holds 1 million Uyghurs in various secret detention camps in this location, and many international media reports have said that there are as many as 1 million people being held in various re-education camps in contemporary Xinjiang, which is one of the reasons that this region attracts so much international press. From the period of the 1950s through the 1970s, the government of the PRC sponsored a mass migration of Han Chinese to the region of Xinjiang and promoted policies of Chinese cultural unity in name at least, and policies punishing certain expressions of Uyghur identity. During this time, militant Uyghur separatist organizations with potential support from the Soviet Union emerged in East Turkestan and established an East Turkestan People's Party. The largest organization in this region, which was founded in 1968, during the 1970s, the Soviet Union supported the United Revolutionary Front of East Turkestan to fight the Chinese central government. However, the circumstances cooled during the course of the 1980s when Soviet support of these movements collapsed and the Soviet Union itself eventually dissolved. However, in 1997, a police roundup and execution of 30 suspected separatists during the month of Ramadan led to large demonstrations in February of 1997 that resulted in the Gulcha incident, which was a confrontation between the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, and a crackdown of several pro-Uyghur nationalist forces that led to at least 9 deaths. The subsequent Urumqi bus bombings later that month killed 9 people in anti-Chinese violence. These bombings also injured 68 individuals, and Uyghur exile groups acknowledged that they were responsible for the bombings in circumstances that the Chinese government then proclaimed were terrorist attacks. In March of 1997, a bus bomb then killed 2 people, and responsibility for this bombing was claimed by various Uyghur separatist groups and the Turkey-based Organization for East Turkestan Freedom. In July of 2009, subsequent protests broke out into riots in Xinjiang in response to a violent dispute between Uyghur and Han Chinese workers in a factory, and they resulted in over 100 deaths in the area in what became essentially ethnic and religious communal violence. Following the riots, Uyghur separatist groups killed dozens of Chinese citizens in coordinated attacks from 2009 through 2016, leading to what the central government in Beijing proclaimed was a spread of radical terrorism. The Xinjiang re-education camps, officially called vocational education and training centers, were then established by the government of the PRC during this period in an effort to combat what the central government called radical terrorism. These were, however, essentially de facto internment camps operated by the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region government and its CCP committee. Human Rights Watch claims that they have been used to indoctrinate local individuals who are not just Uyghur but are Muslims living in the region since 2017 as part of what was proclaimed a People's War on Terror, a co-opting of the U.S. Bush administration rhetoric of the War on Terror and giving it a sort of pro-communist revolutionary spin in a policy that would be announced in 2014. These camps were then part of what many folks will be familiar with as a series of allegations of human rights abuses related to the proclamation that from the part of Uyghur separatists that the PRC was committing a genocide against the Uyghur people. Now, I do want to take a moment here to critically reflect on the coverage in the US press, including in such reporting as one might find in Business Insider, where you have these maps that were circulated purporting to give the locations of various camps, which are detention centers or prison centers, or also what the Chinese government has called re-education camps in East Turkestan. However, if you dig into these reports, you find that these maps were actually compiled by the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement, which is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit human rights and political rights group, which was established in June of 2017. The group officially supports the East Turkestan independence movement and is headed by Salih Khudair, who is a Uyghur American consultant and also a graduate student who founded the group after pre-existing Uyghur organizations failed to effectively call for East Turkestan's independence, and these groups have deemed this particular organization by Salih Khudair as controversial. Now, something to know about Salih Khudair is that as a Uyghur American politician known for advocating for independence of East Turkestan, he was a relatively young individual born in the city of Atush in East Turkestan in 1993. Khudair then fled to the United States as a political refugee with his family in June of 2000. Currently, he's the somewhat self-proclaimed fourth prime minister of East Turkestan government in exile, which is essentially just an office in Washington, D.C. So prime minister of what is the question. Nonetheless, Khudair owes allegiance to the United States branch of civil service and the Oklahoma Army National Guard, with service years extending from 2011 to 2013. He held a rank of Private First Class in the 179th Infantry Regiment of the United States National Guard. So, there are some questions as to where this information has been coming from, and it's important to get the various sides of the reporting cleared up. Consequentially, I want to make an effort here to disaggregate between UN reporting, United Nations reporting, and US responses to that reporting. In 2019, at the United Nations, 54 nations, including the PRC itself, rejected allegations against the PRC and supported China's policies in Xinjiang in the name of anti-terrorism. In another letter, 23 nations accepted the allegations against the PRC and did not support the PRC's policies in the region, although the motivations of some of those countries, including the United States, have been called into question. As recently as September 2020, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a nationalist institute in Australia, reported in its Xinjiang data project that the construction of camps continued despite claims of their function and the claims that their function was winding down. It's important to note, however, that the ASPI Institute is generally branded as simply an anti-Chinese institute in Australia. U.S. lawmakers from the Congressional Executive Commission on China, a bipartisan congressional committee led by Jim McGovern, a Democrat, and Marco Rubio, a Republican, introduced the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in April of 2020, which aims to prevent the importation of PRC projects tied to the evidence of unfree labor. Of course, if we were concerned about unfree labor in the United States, well, to be frank, the state of California and many states wouldn't have any firefighters. So, let's keep this in mind. On September 14th of 2020, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security blocked imports from the United States of products of 4 entities in the area of Xinjiang, and all products were made with labor from Lop County Number 4 Vocational Skills Educational and Training Center, an educational skills and vocational training center that has been criticized for forced internment or being tied to forced internment of Uyghur populations. The products were mostly hair products made in the Lop County Hair Product Industrial Park, and this banning of importation also included apparel produced by the Yili Juwan Garment Manufacturing Company, and also some trade goods from the Baoding LYSZD Trade and Business Company, as well as some cotton products and other products from corporations based in Xinjiang. Of course, it's important for us to keep in mind that Xinjiang itself as a region is also tied to a major production of a crude oil pipeline which runs through the region from Atasu through Urumqi. It's a projected pipeline project, and then is also tied to major coal basins in Xinjiang and the production of coal for the PRC. So U.S. responses here might not only be concerned with human rights issues, and that's important to keep in mind in terms of criticizing the U.S. responses there as well.